Right through the Bible, you have these two factors, pillars of knowledge, law and grace. You have them dominating the Old Testament, and you have them dominating the New Testament. They're right through the Bible. They belong together. They're quite different, but both are vital. So why is it that here we read, the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ? If grace is in the Old Testament, and I'll explain it, just like law, how is it grace was not given until Christ? Surely there is a difference. No, there isn't. The meaning is simple. Both are in the Old Testament. There was law, and the law warned people of their need for righteousness and holiness before God. The law effectively said, that there's more to it than this, God is unapproachable by you, unforgiven, unwashed in the sight of God. The law is reality. It draws us up short. If you like, it pulls us down and tells us that our state is hopeless. We cannot reach the holiness and the perfection of God. We're under his judgment. We're fallen men and women, tainted with sin through and through, capable of good things, but spoiled and tainted and corrupted in our hearts by sin. But grace is also in the Old Testament. It's everywhere in the Old Testament. Forgiveness by trusting in God's kindness and love. You know, when Moses was inspired and moved and taught to construct the movable place of worship for the Old Testament people in ancient times, the tabernacle, it was to be filled with illustrations, pictures, symbols of God's mercy and grace, that he would freely forgive. When that tabernacle became a permanent fixture in one place, and the first temple was built, and in due time a second temple, this temple was full of symbols. The carvings in cedar wood all round the walls, covered with layers of what we would call today gold leaf. But the reliefs, the sculptures as it were, chiseled out of all that cedar, and then resplendent with gold leaf over it, were all the symbols of mercy and forgiveness and peace with God and union with him, his forgiving love, his readiness to embrace and bring people into his family. When Solomon dedicated his temple, he was inspired to offer a great prayer. It's in 1 Kings chapter 8, and it's very long. And it covers every conceivable sin almost. And it says, if anybody does this, or if anybody does that, or if the people as a whole sin against God, and they reject him and neglect him, and he is compelled eventually to withdraw his blessing from them, and even to judge them, and take away his protective hand of defense, so that they're invaded by enemies, and taken captive, and transported into a far country. If such things should happen, in every conceivable eventuality, Solomon prays, if they just so much as look to this house and remember the symbols of mercy and free forgiveness and loving kindness of God, and repent of their sins, he will forgive and bless and restore and save. That's grace. Free forgiveness. Law tells us the standards of God. cuts us down to size, warns us. Grace freely forgives us because we cannot earn or deserve or make amends or make up for our long record of sin. Law and grace, they always went together in the Old Testament, and so they do in the New Testament. So in what sense does grace and truth come by Jesus Christ? Well, in this sense, it's easy, friends. Grace was poured out, free forgiveness, free salvation, free kindness through the Old Testament. On what basis was it given? It was given on the basis that one day God would take away sin. In the future, when Messiah came, God would actually deal with the debt and the burden of sin. You could be forgiven in the time of Moses, in the time of Solomon, freely by God, and you trusted that God would deal with the burden one day, and in the meantime, on account of that, he would forgive you freely. When Christ came, the debt was paid. The transaction was done. The guilt was purged. The punishment was meted out upon him. He paid for it all. In that sense, grace came by Jesus Christ. It came in its application right from the beginning, but it was purchased and paid for and procured by the great work of Christ, the Son of God who became man also, the God-man, when he suffered and died on Calvary, and God the Father put on him all the guilt of all the sins that are ever to be committed by those who would be forgiven in the history of the world. He paid. That's the text. The law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. You know, to not know about grace and about law is to know nothing about life. You can't understand life. All your learning, all the information you have in your head and you acquire down the years is all about the here and now. Material things, material science, the present. You can't know the whole picture. Where do we stand in relation with God? What does God require of us? What will God do to us? Are we under his judgment? Can we find him? Can we be saved by him? You can't know the full purpose of life and the full picture without knowing about law and grace.